Okay, thanks everybody for coming back to the Xanadu Review. My name is Prester John Andrews, but you can just call me PJ. Well, today with me I have Rajeev Ram, and he's a great writer on Substack here. Rajeev, do you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself, the type of writing you do, your blog, the Cactus Brahmin Testimonials, which is a very good name?
Yeah, sure. I always struggle to introduce myself, but I'll start. I'll just say I started writing on Substack about 3 years ago, and basically it was coming out of the long arc of trying to rebuild my life, which had fallen apart in many different ways after COVID, and so I was living in California and working, and then I just completely quit everything. I went through a breakup and stayed with a friend in Missouri for a while, and then I landed up here in Tennessee where I am now. And as a part of that, I got involved in a lot of different projects and just started writing out a lot of things about what was going on in my life. And it wasn't until probably like about a year later or so that I basically came up with the name for the blog, like Cactus Bremen Testimonials, or even like the moniker of being Cactus Bremen. And if people want to read more about that, they can go to my About page on my Substack. But basically, like I'm a second generation immigrant. My parents are both from South India. I was born in Arizona, so I grew up in the Sonoran Desert, and cacti I really like plants. And cacti are a really cool form of plant. And then Brahmin, of course, refers to like my like genetic lineage and stuff like that. So
Very cool. No, it's interesting. I wonder, are you comfortable with talking about that a little bit more? Because it's one of the things I was able to relate to you with. Because in 2021, I kind of had a similar crash. I was working in the tech world, and just like a whole bunch of different things went wrong in my life. And I just kind of had to like quit my job and just kind of take some time off to kind of recalibrate. And it feels like a lot of people went through, the particularities are often, particular to a person, but I feel like a lot of people had kind of a reset around that time, because it was a forced reset because of the material conditions of what was going on at the time. But it feels like that was, people talk a lot about the vibe shift. I feel like that's where it really started to shift, because everybody was forced to take that time to be a little bit more reflective.
yeah, I'll start talking, and then you can ask me questions if you want me to get more detailed. But I think the main couple of things that happened, particularly in 2021, which is already a year through lockdown, is I was denied a promotion at work, which I thought was like relatively unjust. I basically ended up having like a huge conflict with my parents over various things, some of which was around like deciding to quit my job. I went through a terrible breakup, and then the dog that I had at the time, he got hit by a car. And so it was just a lot of losses in a row, and then combined with just the political intensity of lockdown and everything. I basically felt like I was in a very helpless place, and I just needed to drastically change a lot of things and sort of reorient myself and my life in a very fundamental way. And a very interesting thing happened. I'm not someone who particularly prays a lot. I've found that like prayer for me doesn't do the same thing that it does for other people who are like trying to find some sort of direction or meaning or orientation, or sometimes some type of sacredness. But I ended up praying, and then the next day I got a call from my English teacher in high school, who's one of my favorite teachers. And he had recently retired from the high school that he was still teaching at, that I had went to because of some DEI stuff that he refused to capitulate to. So he and his wife bought a cabin in Missouri, and he called me and he was like, "Hey, Larissa," his name is Doug. He was like, "Hey, Larissa's his wife's name. Larissa and I have retired to Missouri. if you're interested, like, you can come visit. And I was like, can I stay for a bit, because my life is completely broken. I have nothing to hold on to. And so that was like kind of the starting point, which I label as like divine providence or divine intervention. And I stayed at his house for 2 months. I basically earned my keep by doing a lot of housework, like duct work, running wires through his garage, mowing the pasture, all sorts of things. And then, again, I guess through divine providence, I ended up making it to this small town in Tennessee. It's about an hour west of Nashville, where there had been a huge flood. And I spent the next year like rebuilding houses and doing other things. And I was just kind of in this holding pattern of like, super overweight. Like, my anorexia had come back while I was working at Google, and it was like round 2 trying to solve that. I lost all my friends. It was like, yeah, all of that stuff. And so I joined a couple of different online groups, and that's when I started writing on Substack. And so I feel like I'm at the end of like a pretty long, like 3 or 4 year arc of like really just trying to put one piece in place back together at a time, to create some sort of meaningful life again.
No, it's fascinating. And that's, you're one of those people who would, like, I would see around on Substack, and I feel like, we run in circles, so to speak, that are adjacent to each other, if not necessarily always overlapping. We have some mutual friends like Ancient Problems or Psy, who I enjoy both of them, their writing and as people quite a bit. But yeah, it's interesting. It tracks very similar to my life, because I was also I wrote about it in an article called "On the Masculine Urge to Die in a Suicidal Cavalry Charge," because I kind of felt that's how I was. I was going through a very similar thing where I was also working in the tech world. I was working like as much as like 60-hour or more a week. I had all, it was my apartment became infested with mice, and we had to like take legal action and like throw out almost all of our stuff. My wife had a miscarriage. All this terrible stuff was happening. And then I just one night, like, I was kind of same thing. I was not in a good physical shape, drinking way too much alcohol, way too much weed. And I had like a little bit of a weed gummy, and it was like an amount that would have been negligible for me at the time because I was totally over consuming. And I ended up having a panic attack, and I thought it was a heart attack, and I was, had to go to the hospital. Then I just kind of hit the walls, like, I need to quit that life. And it just got too much. And that the reason I titled it that, and again, part of the reason I wanted to talk to you is like the masculine aspect of it almost at times can feel like self-harm, that you're putting yourself through all this stuff, all this work, and you're like, okay, I'm doing this for a reason. It's okay that I'm not taking care of myself. I'm not sleeping. I'm eating really poorly, et cetera, et cetera. So it's it's a very interesting, and me, and I've seen so many other people go through that. And funny enough, like I'm moving in with my my in-laws in a small town in Wisconsin in like 6 months to a year now, just so we can hopefully save money for a house. So it was very fortuitous.
Yeah, no, it's definitely true. And it's something that, for example, nowadays, because of a lot of things, because of a lot of the stuff around DEI and woke, there's a lot of discussion on like dysmorphia, like people who are not comfortable with their bodies. And to me, like when I was an adolescent and going through puberty, like all the guys that I saw have like some form of dysmorphia. I don't think I knew anybody. It wasn't related to like anything like trying to change their gender or anything like this. But there's a lot of different expressions where I think guys basically stop taking care of themselves, or they get really intensely involved in work or sports or other things. And, I think like one common thing is like some guys will end up getting really rebellious and like, take their motorcycle and go on a road trip and then like accidentally impregnate a girl. And then other guys will get like really sociopathic and trying to climb the ladder at Wall Street so they can get a lot of fuck you money. And then for me, like my version of it was to become anorexic. So I was in a situation like as an adolescent in my early 20s where it felt like within all of the systems that I was a part of, like whether doing sports or really elite level academics, or any other sort of work, like technological work, like trying to build companies or study things. I just felt an enormous amount of pressure, and my way of dealing with that was to starve myself out of a sense of desperation. And it was very difficult for me because I don't think that's a common way to deal with the stress or like the brokenness as a man. I think I found like towards the later end of my 20s, there are in fact a lot of men who suffered from that. I just didn't know them, or I didn't have contact with them, or like it wasn't really a public thing. But it's definitely relatable. I think men have this different ways of dealing with just feeling under enormous amounts of pressure and really not dedicating the time and energy to figuring out how to climb out of it. And so that's like what happened in my early 20s, you know, when I dropped out of college and I was hospitalized for a bit, and then it started recurring again at Google during COVID. And so it may happen again in my lifetime, but I've learned quite a bit now that I am able to be a little bit more gentle with myself. And so even when I have like huge episodes of shame and other sorts of things, I can manage it a bit better.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you say that because I was talking to, I believe, another mutual friend of ours, Stephen Bradford Long, and we were kind of discussing the same topic about what is a socially acceptable form of self-harm for men versus what isn't. Because it's, you know, something like, and I don't say this punitively towards you or other men who suffer from anorexia, but that's like, it's not a very masculine coded thing, or eating disorders or self-harm. But it's like, you know, if you do something like what I was doing and I'm working 60 hours a week and, you know, drinking a couple bottles of whiskey a week, or, you know, you're working out to the point where you're, you know, damaging the fiber in your joints or something like that, or punching punching the drywall, the classic Kyle move, that's considered a socially acceptable or like sexy thing almost.
Yeah, I think after Me Too, less, but yes,
Mm-hmm.
totally. Anorexia, I mean, like you typically associate with like teenage girls, or like if you talk to certain people, like it's very common within like certain like Jewish communities, like Jewish girls, because of their neuroticism, tend to develop anorexia. So yeah, and I think maybe that's so. There's advantages to maybe having a sort of self harm that, you know, isn't as masculine because maybe there's more available therapeutic help and stuff like that. Um, and so like if you're someone who's working 60 hours a week and drinking years, I mean, my dad was an alcoholic for many years, and I imagined for him it was a similar thing where he felt like he was in the ditch and he didn't know how to climb his way out. And besides like AA, there's not a lot of really help, either like emotional support, spiritual support, or even like shoulder to shoulder support. Like you have a dad or a guy who's married or whoever else who's working himself to death, like what sort of activities can they engage in that sort of helps them reduce their sense of addiction? Yeah, it's I don't know if you got a good answer from Steven. I don't have a good answer.
No,
um
we kind of riffed on it, and that, well, the two things we kind of riffed on one thing I want to pose to you as well. So two kind of jumping off points, and it's kind of a very this is for the ADHD community, is the Xanadu Review podcast. We're going to jump around a lot. So the two things that really occurred to me when you're saying that is, first, I'm curious to if you still work in the tech world or if you've moved away permanently, because I've noticed they're both in the tech world, and the solution that Stephen and I came to, which I'll come to in a second. It's ways of taking this very productive energy that people have, particularly men, that we really want to like do things, go places, make things. And it's kind of like, I think, you know, not that it's not the case with women, but I think in different ways sometimes, but it's like, you know, chaining that's kind of what I see with like these incel gamer types. It's like chaining a German Shepherd to their doghouse, and they just are so anxious that they chew off their own foot. And I see that sometimes in the tech community, and there's a lot of like faux spirituality. I remember there was like a mandated, I was at a startup a while back, and there's a mandated like meditation thing where we'd have to take little 15-minute breaks to do guided meditation. And I just fucking hated that so much. But on the same token is something me and Steven talked about, is how religion and spirituality and these more traditional relationships to people in your society would kind of have a, and obviously it didn't work for everybody, would have these socially acceptable ways to take out this energy or have this community that, like you said, the shoulder to shoulder. And I think with, the tech world just being one example, like modernity and the secular modernity has been trying to find ways to recapture these things with varying levels of success.
Yeah, I could talk for 2.5 hours about the problems that I have with like I call it like coastal Bay Area Buddhism, which is basically a type of rationalistic, meditative.
Dig into it. We have time. I mean, not maybe 2 hours, but
no. But what I'll say, which is related, is that I have found that in a lot of those spaces, so whether it's traditional religion, or whether to the extent that traditional religion exists in like 21st century America, or even like more meditative, spiritual like groups and cultures, there tends to be like this focus on being like peaceful and almost being ascetic and minimalist. And the intention is good, I think, where if you develop a certain amount of equanimity or stoicism, it helps you deal with this sense of intense energy. But more often than I can, like 85% of the time, if there's a way to quantify it, I just feel like the way that people who engage with those communities end up basically training themselves into avoidance. And they don't actually get to a sense where they're doing any sort of practice to actually harness this intense, productive, even aggressive energy. And that's like been one of the big problems that I found. And so, when I talk to people about like, oh, what are the spiritual practices that I'm doing? I'm like, well, I go to MMA because I find beating the shit out of other people in a consensual way and getting the shit beat out of me to be pretty fun and spiritual. I go on really long road trips. I mean, there are times when I will just get really depressed and I will just like drive like 5 hours to a city and like spend the day there or spend the night, or I'll plan trips to go places. Or like I wake up on a Sunday and I feel like I have a lot of energy, anxiety. Like one of the advantages in living in rural Tennessee is like within like an hour radius of driving, there's like tons and tons of state parks. I can just go somewhere and like hike in silence for 8 hours and like really push my body. And like these are the ways that I have found in like the physical realm to deal with a lot of like the intense aggressive energy that comes out. And I prefer my solution than to just like sitting on a cushion and pretending that I can achieve some sort of peace. And so then this relates back to your tech question, like, am I still working in tech? So I actually have gotten a new job recently where I'm working at this company that's developing all sorts of AI characters for various platforms. And it's really actually very interesting. They're not a VC company, and the CEO, I talked with him, he made a very strong decision to do that because he felt like taking venture capital money would fuck up the incentives for the company. But we have people who like ask us for AI characters that can help promote their like cryptocurrency platform, or help like give people questions, answer questions about products that they're selling. But we're not delivering them like some chatbot. We're actually delivering them like a compelling character that they can feel like either their own internal employees can use to learn things. And for me, I find this to be I think there's a lot of people who, if they end up working in like these very ambitious tech companies, like they ended up feeling like, oh, like ambition is bad, or like ambition, the only thing that ambition does is like create more ad clicks so that someone in Omaha can buy shampoo, and that like increases our stock price. And again, I find that it's not so much that like you shouldn't be ambitious about building technology. It's that you should be able to relate to how you're building and who you're working with around that. And I don't find that like sitting on a cushion and meditate, like you actually have to go find projects and find people and take a little bit of risk. And like that might mean changing how you conceive of employment. Like right now, I'm exclusively on a contract basis. So they like pay, like I'm not like a W-2 employee, and that works for the company because the company gets like whatever $50,000 contracts from various clients, but then they like just pay me as a contractor, and it helps that I don't have young children, so I don't necessarily need health insurance, and that's a whole another thing about how do you like try to create a life where you're not beholden to a job because of health insurance. But I think the point that I'm trying to make, right, with regards to what you're talking about, in terms of like this intensity, this masculine intensity, instead of using it for self-harm, like whatever spiritual practice or whatever community they're embodied in, like for me, the one of the reasons I like being in this place is that in rural Tennessee is I can drive to places, or I have people who, if they need to build a deck, I can spend like 8 hours building a deck, which takes a lot of effort. And I think I've placed a lot of time and effort into creating some sort of circumstance where pretty easily I have opportunities to do things like do a contract for like a really crazy AI company, or go on a road trip, or go on an 8-hour long hike. And for me, that's what helps me practice with these intense energies more than anything else.
No, that's fascinating. There's a bunch of different directions that I want to take that, but it seems like really the through line, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, is there, it feels like, be it with the tech world or any of this stuff, or when you talk about, and I'm definitely curious on your perspective of, I've called it like, spiritual colonization, basically, with this, because I fucking hated, because I was like the system admin for this tech startup that I was working at, and I had to be like the one that set up the meditation software for everybody, and it was just this really, really surreal experience. And I feel like we could riff on startup culture for 3 hours, but the point I'm trying to make is there's this lack of embodiment that exists. And I think that, be it, you talk about this masculine energy that exists, especially in these startup spaces, that has been, especially because I feel like, there was, leading up to 2020, there's the talk of the backlash to woke now. I think it didn't come from nowhere. I think there was very valid criticisms of how that can be misused and abused. And I saw it firsthand myself as well, despite, I find like, this is maybe a tangent, and I would be curious to what your experience is. Like, the more a company talks about its culture and the more woke it is, the more abusive an environment it's going to be. At least that's been my experience. But there's this lack of embodiment of being disconnected from, be it a startup you're working on, at least for me, like obviously I don't want to dox myself, but the company and the product that we were creating was a niche of a niche. And like, I didn't care. Like I literally didn't know what the company did for like the first 3 months that I worked there, because I was like a back end system admin guy. Be it that lack of embodiment, and especially I'm curious to your perspective, because you grew up in that tradition, but taking these, in the truest sense of the word, it's cultural appropriation of these traditions that existed in a specific cultural context and physical context, and lifting it out and trying to just basically make a intolerable situation tolerable. So again, I realize this is becoming like my maybe my signature, for better or for worse, that I ask really long-winded questions.
No, your thing about how basically a lot of these practices, what you just said, trying to make intolerable situations more like, that's what 85% I feel like of a lot of, it's like people have this view of like, okay, they get into some bullshit job, or maybe they're like a healthcare administrator, so they're processing like 600 insurance claims a month, like a very meaningless job, especially now that one ought to be automated, so that they can spend more time with their family or whatever else, right? And so then they get into these things of like, well, if I meditate, then it'll help me better at my insurance claim processing job. And it's like, I think I think actually the goal should be like to enter into some practice, knowing that it might like change you in a way that you decide you want to do something else. It might clarify your desire. And this is why, for the most part, I mean, I grew up. I wouldn't say I grew up in a family that did tiger parenting. In fact, my parents were very conscious not to do tiger parenting, and I think that's just because both of them are very like liberty oriented, like adventurous, seeking type people. Like my dad married my mom. It was a love marriage. Like he rejected the person that was arranged for him. Like they're very wild spirits, and so I obviously inherit some of that genetically from them. But still, I felt like there was a lot of high expectations for me to like go and succeed at the University of Chicago, you know, as like the #5 school in the country, and go work at Google and all of these things. And I just realized at a certain point that trying to fit myself in better in an institutional shape doesn't actually let me provide good value to the world. So that's kind of, I may have lost the point that you were trying to ask about.
Like I said, this podcast is for the ADHD community. But that's I definitely resonate with what you're saying, because that's I about a month ago I got hit with layoff. I mean, you work in the tech world, the waves come and go. If I'm being honest with myself, I feel like, I wasn't giving 110%. Like it wasn't like, completely phoning it in, but in these worlds, not getting 110%. When the rounds of layoffs come, it's like, all right, let's maybe get rid of this guy. And that's kind of been my experience as well. Like I originally went into the tech world just because at the time, like I was doing something I was passionate about. I was a chef and I loved that, but the money was shit. And the hours were shit, and I could do shit money or shit hours, not both. That's when I decided to transition into tech, because it was like relatively low barrier to entry for relatively good money. And at least to me, like, okay, I can, there's nothing that's like difficult about tech to me, at least in the sense that it's like, it's very logical, it's input output. You're never going to be in a Linux command line, put in a prompt, and like it's inconsistent results. The language works how it does. So for me, it was very easy to learn, but I was never able to really truly be into it. I don't know about you. It sounds like maybe you're in a similar situation. I knew people who like were obsessed with computers and they loved the process ever since they were kids. But for me, no, not really. It was just kind of a job. And I think it's not a world that's built for people like that, especially with, I'm sure we'll get into this more, with the advent of AI and LLMs becoming more prevalent, which I think is maybe a little bit overstated, but I'm curious to your position on that with more foreign workers being, contributing. It feels like, at least to me, the tech world is not what it was even 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I just published a thing yesterday, and I probably should have sent this to you. So one of the reasons why I have ended up struck up a friendship with Walt Bismarck, and I ended up becoming close with him, and now I'm working with him closely in his Tortuga Society, is actually the note that, so he notoriously worked as like this, making like racist Disney parodies for the alt-right and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But he described the alt-right as like kind of a startup environment, right? Very jovial, like harnessing those really masculine productive tendencies. And he wrote this piece about like how he's no longer a white nationalist, and everyone was like crapping on him. And I wrote like, I find this to be really relatable. Obviously, like I'm not in the alt-right and I'm not a white nationalist, mm-hmm. but like the energy.
It's a pretty bad one.
Right, exactly. I don't think I would make the qualification.
Yeah.
But the reason we became friends, and the reason I've helped him build his like society, is because to me, like it's been reconfiguring my relationship to like what's an actual job. Like I don't think like doing things just for the money is like that. There's perfectly fine to do that. I don't think that should be the only motivation, but it's perfectly fine to do things like just because you can earn money from it. And then also like yesterday, I published this piece on what we're starting called the Tortuga Technical Institute. And it's actually about doing a lot of tinkering. And this is something that I'm like you. I never grew up like super obsessed with like hardware or things like that. But with the advent of LLMs, like there are times when like I'll look at a paper on like hardware design and I'll feed it into the LLM and I'll like say like, hey, how practical would it be to like source some of the parts and build this or print chips and stuff like that. And I feel like my relationship to tinkering and technology has become a lot more rich. And part of what I enjoy about like this particular piece, I think what we're trying to show is that you don't have to be like a super freak, like nerd obsessed person who like, starts tinkering with gadgets from the time you're 6 years old. But I think with like the loss of prestige from like big tech, and also the advent of LLMs and a bunch of people who are sick of working in those environments and have exited those institutions, there's actually like a pretty exciting wave of people who are like, what if we can actually build, like, for the first time in my life, like a couple weeks ago, I was like, maybe I could build my own server from scratch and it wouldn't be that hard. I talked to a couple of people and they were like, yeah, you could probably for like $6,000, like put something together. Maybe like if you're part of a group that you enjoy like shit posting or talking about, or like, even for your ADHD thing, like what if you deployed a local version of an LLM that helps you like think about like 17 different ADHD topics you want to talk about on your podcast? Like, what if it helps you like run an analysis on like something you're really, really want to dig into on like, whatever it is, whether it's like spirituality or something else. And so I'm finding that for me, I'm just having a whole new relationship to technology itself. And I've been really lucky to find people who are thinking along the same lines. And I guess like I'm encouraging anybody who else who thinks like, oh, tech is not for me, or like the only reason I like tech is to get money. It's like, well, earn money, that's fine. But I think there's a lot of new ways to do things that are like anti-institutional, like that don't make you like force you again into this institutional state where you have to accede to some stupid organization who claims to have certain values but doesn't abide by them at all. So
no, it's the values thing is so funny because we had always joke. I've been in this world for about 7 years now, and like anytime you've probably seen this too, like every company has like, here's our corporate values, and it's almost like you could do what do you call it, the Mad Libs type of thing, or like a Chinese restaurant. It's like Jade Garden, Dynasty Village. It's the same thing of like, oh, honesty, diversity, blah blah. It's the same shit over and over again, reiterated, because at the end of the day, it is just about making money, which is a kind of trivially true thing to say because obviously it's a company. But at the same time, like if it were more honest and upfront about it, like I've joked before, like the last startup I was at, the CTO, one of the C-suite people, he just like had open disdain for the IT department, which I actually really liked because like everybody else treated us like shit, but he would, they would be nice and use all the right woke corporate language. And this guy just like openly hated us, which I really loved. But I guess it's just a side anecdote, but
yeah, I've recently come out like more hardline against like what I call institutional centrism, because I feel like that's exactly what it represents. Like you're supposed to be nice and inclusive, but really it just like drives the dagger in deeper because you like pretend to be polite to people who you actually don't want to associate with.
Like be kind is such a non-statement and such a non-value. And I think like, people like you or me are obviously, and I don't even think that we're like, these brilliant Machiavellian, like we see through the bullshit. Everybody sees through the bullshit, I think, other than, complete NPCs, I think. But some people want to be able to buy into it. There was definitely that culture around tech of there was a sexiness that came with, working in tech that I think really has been kind of almost completely destroyed. But it's interesting you say that, and I kind of want to look into it more because with the AI and LLMs, I use it, basically daily for things as far as like organizational stuff, or to me, like it's a better Google in a lot of ways, or you can parse really large sets of data, or like you said, you can get I have an idea, how would this be feasible? And I think we're going to see we're already seeing, kind of like with the project that you're talking about, within our lifetime, people who are high agency and can use these technologies are really going to be able to take off and do interesting things with it. And I feel like we're going to see just a really, really big gap between people who can use AI in these technologies or people who can't. Because I've said this before, like I know so many people, even of our generation, like the millennial generation, who have this knee-jerk like hatred and fear of AI, which in some ways I get, because like, people call AI art slop, and I generally agree. Like AI writing is generally pretty bad. But that having been said, to me, it's like if our parents in 1990 had been like, "Oh, I don't know about this internet and computer stuff," you're gonna get left behind. It depends on implementation and how you're gonna use it.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I found that I guess comes a little bit more naturally to me, maybe, I don't know, I haven't really looked into this, but like I'll have like there's a lot of people who talk about like using the AI for therapy, let's say, right? Or to like sound out some emotional issues. And like I do that too. But for me, like I have a tolerance for like I'll be talking to the AI for 20 minutes and basically in some way it's just like projecting back to me some of the things I'm talking about or like surfacing things from my subconscious. And then I'll feel like satiated and like I'll walk away. I'll be like, we had a good session. And I feel like this about a lot of the tools that I use. Like, of course, like I have addictive tendencies where I might doom scroll and stuff like that. But I tend to like personify a lot of the things that like, I spend a lot of like, I have to mow my grass in the summer now because I have a lawn, which is a new experience for me, not, having grown up in the desert. But like my thing with like tools and technology and stuff is like, I have enough where I can listen to myself and be like, this is not working. I want something new. I want to try something different. So there's this just natural curiosity going on. And I think that's something you certainly seem to have too. And so for me, like LLMs like aren't a threat in the sense that like, if the tool doesn't help me like discover things or help me make connections or like connect with other writers, like if it just puts out slop, but the slop doesn't actually help me like engage with another person's ideas in a way that they can disagree well, or other things like that, like I just will put it aside and like try it later. And like to me that's like what's high agency. Because the other thing about high agency is that you're going to have a lot of people who are a high agency, but they use AI to make a bunch of scam stuff, right? Like they make products that are based on spaghetti code that don't work well, that don't really do what they're offer, or like it helps them make money, but they make the world a better place, or they pollute the information commons. And so for me, like it's certainly agency is, I think, correct. And then there's also some just like natural inquisitiveness where you have to like have a relationship to the tools that you use, and try to understand like what it is that you're trying to do, or like create something with the LLM and show it to someone else, and then they like come back to you and tell you that it's retarded, and like keep that as part of like a feedback loop. So for me, yeah, I don't know what point I was trying to make. Sorry about that. I keep doing that.
No, that's okay. I think that's part of the fun of conversations like these. I guess this is not a bad time to shift gears a little bit then, because one of the I was rereading some of your stuff this morning. I really liked "My Country 'Tis of Thee, Sweet Land of Liberty," and writing it was very like a really good slice of Americana. And you or like somebody like Lurpa Strike write very interesting little, in addition to everything else you do, these little slices of Americana. And I'm interested to what being American means to you, because there's a lot of talk right now, especially on the online right spaces. And I kind of exist in multiple different spaces, right spaces, left spaces, just because I'm a curious person and I want to hear lots of different people's perspective. But on the surface, like you having relationships with somebody like Walt Bismarck, and I'm not super familiar with him, like I know of him because of the Substack world, or what it means to you, because again, on the surface, that's very contradictory with your ethnic heritage and your background. But at the same time, like, and especially like in the context of like the H-1B question that's going on right now, I just think of you as an American, not just because you were born here, but because you have, you're clearly like want to be a part of the culture here. You have made that part of yourself. You haven't completely, whitewashed your background. You still take that as a part of who you are and making that a part of America. Because to me, that's been the American project from the very beginning, starting as a colonial project to Anglo, and then expanding the franchise to different types of European, and then since then more like South American, and then since the '60s more Asian and Indian, et cetera, et cetera. So what's your thoughts? How does that slot in for you? Because that seems to be the question right now. Like, can America continue as an entity like it was, or is it just going to become more of like a federated, like Brazil or something like that?
Yeah. First, I want to say like what you just is very meaningful to me. And I don't want to get too sappy, but I think like I'm someone who tends to be pretty private about a lot of the different things that I wrestle with in terms of their emotionality and like the contradictions. And just because I don't like to write a piece like that actually is not characteristic of me. And that's mostly just because part of it is I don't want to be misunderstood, but part of it is that I don't have like the right answers, I don't think, for all the things, but I do want to demonstrate that I am engaging with, like, for example, like if you're asking what's an American, I mean, one place to start is like, well, if you're an American citizen, I think like in the year 2025, it's very unclear like what set of responsibilities you are supposed to accede to or undertake as a citizen, and like how you should use your rights and as an American citizen to like accede those responsibilities. I think if you talk to like 60% of the population, they won't have a well thought out answer for that. Mm-hmm. And so ever since COVID, again, like, one of the things I'm certainly exploring certain things for myself. I think like a pretty dramatic change for me. I grew up as a religious vegetarian. And part of that is because of part of my religion, like one of our values is sort of like nonviolence towards nature. And so, we don't like to kill animals, but I actually started eating meat like this year or last year. And one of the reasons is because I'm around people who like have homesteads and they raise and kill their own chickens. And I've actually slaughtered chickens with them. And like they do it in a very humane way, far more humane than like factory farms and stuff like that. And there's farms that I go to where I see like couples raising their own cows and stuff like that. And of course, meat is delicious, and nutritionally too, it's helped me with a lot of my neuroticism and things like that. And so for me, like this is, I think, a characteristic example of the type of integration that maybe you're talking about, which is like, for me, I still want to care about the environment and animal welfare, like in terms of my ethics and my religious upbringing. But something I discovered, which is really interesting, is when I looked into like the history of like, let's say my certain like clan came from, which there's a name for it, which I don't have to say here, but like actually my clan like did used to like eat cows and stuff like that, and they gave up that practice a long time ago. And so for me, like there's a way in which I'm still trying to like respect that heritage, but also understand that there are ways to like slaughter and eat animals ethically. And then there are also people in America who like are Catholic or Methodist, and that is also part of their value system. And so you can learn to get to know them better and kind of negotiate and have an open discussions about that. And I think that's something maybe like implicitly I'm trying to capture in a piece like, My Country 'Tis of Thee, is that, people should spend some time, whether it's immigrants or someone else, like they should go and see how different groups are conducting their lives. And they should try to like ingratiate themselves to those groups and see what it's like to take up those practices, even if you don't like, that's part of the reason why, I'm still Hindu, but I am going to a church because I want to see not only like what the church believes, but I look at the church and like how they operate in the community, like how they show up for people and like do house repairs for people who need it, like how they give food to people who are struggling. Like there's a lot of people in rural America, like kids especially, who have parents that are drunk or like struggle with drugs, and the church like fills a gap by, you know, providing food and resources. And so, you know, I'm obviously like, I think there are people on the right wing who have a very like strict sort of sense of like blood and soil nationalism, which I think is very stupid. I think even if you talk to someone like, well, like it's very stupid, but I think there's a way that I don't know if I'll ever come up with an answer, but I am trying to like travel to a lot of places in America that have like characters, have like specific characters, whether they're towns or states, based on the history and the people who came and settled there. And I don't know, like that to me is like part of the project of being an American citizen. And then at some point, I don't know, whether it's 5 years from now or 8 years from now, it'll become more clear to me, like, okay, so now that we're in like 2030 or 2035, here's what I've learned. And from that, I think that translates to a very specific set of like responsibilities that an American citizen should have for the 21st century, and like how they should use their rights to execute those responsibilities.
No, I think that's a really interesting and very responsible way of looking at it, because that's I know you're born here and you're an American citizen, so you're not an immigrant, but being from that background, I feel like it gives you a unique perspective, because I always love talking to people who are from an immigrant background or immigrants who deal with that dialectic of coming from somewhere else and then trying to integrate. And I do think it is important to try to integrate. I think
what has an impact too is both my parents became American citizens before they had me and my brother too. Mm-hmm. So it's not like, you know, we only became American citizens because we were born on this soil, but it was like as a part of their marriage and their life, they also were American citizens and wanted to have an American family. And I think that has an impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that does seem to be a notable difference. And that was something I was going to get at, of people who are coming here specifically to be American and become a part of the project. Because that's something I'm struggling with writing about, my thoughts on immigration, because it's a very nuanced topic. And I don't, like me personally, like I don't have any sympathy for like the blood and soil white nationalism, because like I find it morally abhorrent. B, trivially easy to kind of pick apart. That having been said, I don't want to see, like, you know, the Vivek Ramaswamy, like America is an idea. I do think that integration and assimilation is good and it's important, but I also think integration and assimilation is a two-way street. So I don't necessarily, you know, not everybody is going to go about it like you are, because you're obviously like a thoughtful guy with like particularities of your own upbringing that makes that interesting. But like, I don't think everybody is required to, just like, you know, not everybody who is born here is required to have like this knowledge of the entire history of the country. Like, I think it's okay to have like, you know, I'm from this culture. This is just where I live. I do things because that's what we do here. And I think that's good. And honestly, I think it's good for most people. I don't know if that's a more right-wing belief now, that I think, you know, a lot of people are low agency, not because they're dumb, but because they're like well adapted to their environment and their circumstance. And based on your writing, it feels like you don't feel that you are, or at least weren't. And that's kind of how I felt personally. Like, I don't know how much of my stuff you've read, but like my dad was a pastor. So I was raised in the church, but also very much set apart from it. My family moved around a whole bunch, different parts of the country and Canada, and just particularities of my personality. I feel like I never really quite slotted in. And because of that, like, I'm always a little bit of a part, and more of an observer, but I think my life would have been better off if I had been able to slot in more. I don't know. What would you think? Would you think you would be better off or happier if it was easier for you to slot in, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, I think, for me to answer, because there's a part of me that feels like, yes, it would be very nice to find like a very niche ecology or whatever, behavioral or cultural ecology that just I'm a part of. On the other hand, so number one, I think you, like me, probably score very high on openness to experience in the big five. And I
Hmm.
think just in general, people who score high in openness are going to have trouble like fitting into like, you know, wherever it is, like any sort of like very conservative, like chuddish mentality. And that's just because people who like are open want new and novel experiences. I think like in the 90s, I think one of the reasons why people lionize the 90s so much is because there kind of was an understanding that like if you're a high in openness weirdo and you want to try to experiment, you go to this part of America and there's kind of like a soft wall where you leave like mainstream America alone, whether it's like Indiana or Nebraska, and you let them do their own thing. And there was kind of an implicit understanding of that. And now it just feels like there's like a strain that tries to like say like, well, if you're not 99 percentile openness, then you suck and you don't deserve a good life. And it's like, no, I want to go back to a model where people have an implicit understanding there's a soft wall between people who want more like stable or conservative, ecologies, even economies of trade, where like,
Hmm.
the mechanic shop at the,
Free
down the street.
association, I believe they call it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so that's part of it. And even if that were the case, I'm not sure if I would fit in that. But the other thing is that I'm a very stubborn and independent person. So despite how much I claim to be like lonely and a misfit, I think there's a part of me that chooses it. And I think a lot of it is hardwired. My mom loves to tell this story to people. I don't know why, but maybe this is because something she appreciates about me. But when I was like 1 or 2, right? So my mom would like feed me as a kid. There was this one day when I was like 1 or 2 years old, and she was like trying to feed me like peas or like applesauce or whatever. And I just like took the spoon from her and I started feeding myself, and I never let her feed me again after that. And I feel like that actually captures like a lot of my personality. I'm like a very fiercely independent person. It's like I will depend on you for a little bit, or I'll learn from you, or I'll try to figure out what you're doing because I think you're doing something smarter or more interesting. But my goal is like I always want to take the fucking spoon and
Hmm.
feed myself. And so that doesn't necessarily like comport with having a healthy sense of interdependence. And I think that's something I'm trying to solve. Like, is there times when I should put the spoon down, you know?
Yeah, and let somebody else feed you. It can be very hard to ask for help. That's one of the that's the joke. Like, men would literally rather do XYZ rather than go to therapy. And I know, like, I am the example of that. Like, I would literally rather give myself a heart attack at 30 than go to therapy. Um, but one quick anecdote, and that actually leads back into another question I had for you, because I think it's interesting how, especially what our parents remember, like the stories that define you. For me, like the two were like, I had two sisters on either side of me, and like they were criers, they were difficult. Like my older sister would like crawl out of the crib and cry and like make people see her, which is very emblematic of her personality. But I was apparently the easy baby. I just kind of like to chill, lay in my crib, watch my mobile. I'm like, yeah, this is pretty cool. And they're like, from a young age, I was like, I don't particularly want to play with the other kids. I was an early reader. I just kind of like play with my Legos, read my books, and I'm good. But that which I think like speaks to my personality and interests now, for better or for worse. But that leads into what I was going to talk about, another issue, because I think either it's by circumstance or genetics or just random luck of the draw, people who have similar personalities to us, very high openness, who are just, and I just so we're not misconstrued, I don't think we're like, we're the, what do you call it? Delta male or whatever it is, like a Sigma male. It's like, oh, we're, I think it's largely circumstance, right? But I think there always are people like that by circumstance or in some cases like homosexuality or neurodivergence, etc. There's always people who are going to be outside of the tribe. And I think a lot of traditional societies and religions would create roles for people like that, be it a priest role or a shaman role. I'm not, educated enough about Hinduism and Indian culture. You could probably speak to like the culturally specific versions of that. But that's something I've been thinking about and struggling with is how I've said before, I've heard other people say this, that traditionalism and religion are kind of, if you want to use the tech term, like the collective troubleshooting of the human race. Like, of course, there are always going to be people who are outside of this paradigm, like people that I mentioned, but most people, it's going to work for pretty fine to have a nuclear family, have kids, work in your community, exist in a larger community, and a constellation of friends, family, coworkers, etc., who have that same, or who exist in that same role, right? But with the advent of modernity, both by like being dislocated from these traditional societies, etc., and just like culture advancing to the point where like kind of like when I was talking about with the meditation and a pod at a tech startup, it's so removed from the context that it was originally existed and created for, that like the be it that or even Christian religious rites seem kind of silly out of context. So I don't know, do you think, is there a way to recapture that or a way to reintegrate it? Because I see a lot of people I see, especially on the online right sphere, who to me seem like Christian LARPers, because my dad was a pastor. Like I there's like several lines back of pastors. I'm the one who broke the line. So I know Christianity very, very well. And these people I don't really think are real Christians. I think they're just reactionaries who it gives them a sense of cultural power. And it seems very fake. It's a LARP. So I'm curious to like your perspective on that, especially somebody who still considers himself a Hindu, but also going to church.
Yeah. A lot of questions in that are really rich.
Sorry, I do that.
No, it's good. I like it. This is like it makes it fascinating. Like this, you're hitting my chords of fascination in the right place. The first thing I'll say is, to your point about the LARPing is yeah, I didn't realize this until I engaged with, I guess, what you would call like the e-Christians or like the online Christians. But there's something that very, very, very like strongly enrages me about people who like, especially like millennials who were like atheists or like agnostic liberals for their whole life. And then like at 35, they decided, for whatever reason, I don't even have to interrogate their reasons. They just were like, okay, well, Catholicism is the real thing, and here's all this stuff. And that's even fine by themselves if like they're born again. But then they go around telling people that like, you don't understand real religion. And I'm like, you are not going to come to someone, you're not going to come to someone like me who, like, for example, had a struggle between reconciling like my private religious instruction in Hinduism with like trying to uphold like a basic sense of like Protestant public morality. You're not gonna come telling me that I don't understand fucking religion. Like,
I joke that these people, these were all like, and I knew so many of these people. They were like, Gamergate kind of, like edgy atheists who, late in life became Catholics. And I joke, they like switched memorizing like Sonic the Hedgehog lore for Bible verses, and it has about the same like seriousness.
Yeah. And, I'm never gonna, if I know someone personally and they seem to be very convicted in a particular religious direction or stuff, like, I don't want to be someone who like automatically treats it as a LARP. But yeah, like if you're gonna come to someone like me and claim that like I don't understand morality or ethics because like I'm not explicitly religious or stuff like that, like fuck off. Like our conversation's done. And it's just done because
there's nothing to say.
Right. And so like I think what you're asking is actually something that someone who's genuinely being like, for someone like me, I'm like, is there a way to like adapt some of like the Hindu practices and rituals to like the situation that I'm in? There's probably some ways, yes, and there's probably some ways where like, no, it's not as appropriate. And so like there are times when I still like say mantras and do certain rituals, but like, you know, I'm not fixing to like create like this grand temple experience where I collect all the middle of Hindus in the middle of like Tennessee and like we become this bonded religious community. Like, I think there are other things that I can do, like being part of a church community, finding out churches that share my values, like, you know, stuff like that that seem a lot more appropriate. And who knows, like, you know, particularly because I'm a Brahmin, like, let's say I was living 200 years ago, okay, like maybe like homosexuality, you know, it's not a sanctioned practice. It's never really been a sanctioned practice in most traditional societies. It's great that I, you know, live in a society that is a lot more open and tolerant about that. That gives me the chance to like find a spouse in that regard. But even then, like, probably there would have been some arrangement where someone's like, oh, well, you're a Brahmin, like, go just become a teacher. Like, we're not going to have like an official marriage ceremony, but if you find a partner or something, like, they can live with you. And like, these are your talents and we'll make free use of you for like that. And, you know, that's probably what would have happened. And, you know, that's why, for example, like right now I'm working at this tech company, but a lot of what I do is actually like a lot of documentation and teaching about a lot of the tools that we're using. And so, like, you know, that's one way to use the natural skills that I have. Is it like the ideal way according to the traditional system? I don't know, but I like the fact that I can earn a good paycheck doing that at a tech company. And I like that I'm in a situation where I can still like practice my religion relatively privately without interference from the state. And do it in a way that isn't just like me doing my own thing, but actually allows me to be in public and have like some sort of public commitments to like serving other people in certain ways. So yeah, I think I answered like 40% of your question there.
Okay. So we kind of talked a little bit about the concept of, you know, religion as kind of like best practices or collective troubleshooting and reintegrating some of these traditions in a more modern context, which is something that I found interesting because I feel like I want to put a finer point on. I'd be curious to like the degree which Christianity.
I'll give you an example, which is I think something I talked about on stream with Stephen and Lirpa when we did that last Sunday, which is most religions, if you look at them, they have very specific like communal rituals around grief. And that's because like grief is really difficult to deal with on your own. Like if your kid dies in a war or like your spouse dies of natural age, whatever the case is, or like you sustain like a really heavy loss in your life, like your factory, your business blows up, whatever the case is, right? Like it's very difficult to understand like when you're in the middle of grief, like what you're supposed to do. And like it sounds like, you know, someone needs to come and help you, give you food, and like someone needs to like remind you that like it's still okay to take a shower, like even though like you still feel horrible. And so like I think, you know, I'm not going to claim that like any sort of like particular religion has like the best sort of like attitude to like how to handle grief, but I think that, for example, is one of the functions of like a good healthy religious ecosystem. If like someone is down bad, you should have like a good list of like 10 or 15 people around them that like kind of know the steps to take to give them what they need to before asking. And so, you know, it's just small things like that. Like I generally, yes, religion answers like metaphysical questions about like where do we come from and stuff like that, right? But I think like on the practical day-to-day, it's stuff like that where it matters the most.
Yeah. And it kind of strikes me something you're saying about the Brahmin aspect of your heritage and how you would have like a specific place in society, even as a gay man, or, you know, what have you. There's even like European equivalents, like, you know, the if you've read older like Victorian literature, like, you know, the metaphor of like somebody who's a confirmed bachelor, or even somebody like a US president, like I'm blanking on his name. He was right before Lincoln, who was like one of those, you know, I had my best friend who I lived with for years and like was almost definitely gay. So this was something that existed in society as kind of healthy ways for, I don't want to say deviance in a punitive way, but deviant from the norm of, like, just in a purely anthropological sense, since no problem with homosexuality personally, dabbled a little bit myself in my youth. But point being that I think that there is something to be said for, again, these class structures, or even just like um, places in society, because you were talking about like the metaphysical side versus the practical side that exist for different people in different places. Like I often say, like, even in the height of my like edgy atheist days, um, I really had a hard time. There's people that's like, you need to tax the churches, or being very anti-church in general, because I grew up in the church and I saw all these things. Like you mentioned, people would like give food out, or like we would do yearly school supplies drives and things that are good, and that's something that's important for everyday people. Like, not that I don't want to say like they don't need to be thinking about the metaphysical side, because I think everybody thinks about that, but what's going to be useful to you in your day to day is not necessarily the metaphysical. It's getting food, getting yourself taken care of, community. And I'm
I mean,
curious about
the problem about all the religious LARPers that you're talking about is they
Mhm.
have all these grand metaphysical ideas about what the ideal society looks like. And then you like dig into a little bit and you realize that it has no connection to anything that's actually empirically tested on the ground in terms of
Mhm.
social organization and things like that. Right?
Yeah.
So so metaphysics is great, and I like talking about like the metaphysics of divinity and how that all works, and that's all very important. And then also, like, this is something that I talked about again in this technical piece. Like, it doesn't matter whether you're like talking about religious technology, like computer technology, like some component of it has to be like empirically tested in a wide variety of conditions. Otherwise it just becomes hallucinatory.
Yeah. And I guess I'm curious. The two things that made me think of, when you said that, was one of your pieces you sent me that you felt was important for me to read for this conversation was about like I even forget the title of it, because I'm just so much not a math person other than in the technical side. But what I got out of it, and again, I'm not a math person, so maybe I'm completely stupid, was about the process of finding these things. It's about the process more than necessarily the results, and being able to share that with somebody that has meaning. Am I
Yeah.
off base there?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of people. I mean, this partly makes me be like Bremen as well, is like, for me, when I'm thinking about like how do you educate people or how do you get them to like be interested in things, like I was a math tutor for many years, and because of a lot of like I worked at an organization that tutors math, and because of that, like I saw a lot of the incentives that go on around like, oh, people want to get taught, math to like pass the SAT. Never mind that, like, if you like below a certain IQ, you're probably never gonna get a good score in the SAT. That's a whole
Mhm.
nother discussion. But for me, it's always been really important to like understand like how to get people delighted about certain things. And this is why I never became an academic, is because especially in the environment that we live in right now, I find that most of the interesting work that's being done in like mathematics research or even science research is not being done like within the confines of institutions. That you can get support and funding and make friends with people from that, but it's really about people who are doing exactly what you said, which is like, I'm following this train of thought and I'm looking and doing reading, whether it's in like neuroscience or math or whatever else, and I'm seeing how it applies, and I'm testing it against like real world scenarios where I feel I could apply it, and then like developing a more mature and comprehensive view of the thing you're studying. And so yeah, that's I mean that's very important to me.
Mhm. And it's interesting. I'd be curious on your perspective, because and it's another one of those things that is really in the cultural zeitgeist right now, talking about, um, the dreaded wokeness and its encroachment upon these institutions. And to me, like, I don't know, have you heard of an author called Peter Turchin?
Yeah, he's the guy who did the like civilizational cycles, right?
Yeah, and one of the main things he talks about is he says, people who are hyper fixated on wokeness are missing the forest or the trees. He talks about wokeness as a feature of elite overproduction because they're with the way that the university system exists now is much more cookie cutter, but also like traditionally speaking, the university was for depending on the cultural context, like the Brahmins or the nobles or whatever exists in your cultural context of that society. And in the post World War II, both the baby boom of like the pure population surge, but also the more democratizing impulse, which I think on its face was good. But you have, as a result, with these university degree systems, way more people who are vying for these positions than there could ever be. And also there's this talk of, with the SATs and whatnot, and IQ, like realistically, not everybody's going to be an astronaut. And there's like this idea of liberalism, which I think is good on its face, but I think there are problems with it. But like the blank slate theory is not necessarily true. I don't agree with like the what do you call it, the human biodiversity people who basically said that it's genetic, but I do think culture is very real. And like you talk about the Brahmin culture, or like I see Jewish culture are very like have a very strong emphasis and prizing of education, often for its own sake. You have like the Germanic, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant work ethic that is very like business focused, and all these different cultures that have this beautiful diversity. But I do think realistically, like not all cultures are the same, and some people will take that on both sides, like a negative, like one culture is better or worse than the others. I do genuinely believe in like the beauty of diversity, but realistically, I think there's going to be differences in culture that exist that are going to be downstream.
Yeah, I think this gets to a point too that oftentimes liberalism proper misses, because at this point too, it's become such a like a intellectual ideology. Is that like the other half of the coin is when you talk about like cultural standards, like what obligations do certain cultural groups or bodies have to like other ones or to the members in their group? So for someone like me, to take your example, I'm not going to become an astronaut, simply because at one point when I was in college, like I spent like 2 days like opening astrophysics textbook, and I just got bored, and I was like, yeah, this is not for me. However, there's a role that I could play where if I'm writing something like that math piece or something else, I stimulate or encourage a process in someone else who does have the interest in becoming an astrophysicist. And I feel like with sort of this sort of very narrow focus of liberalism on credentialism and status and getting to high status institutions, it's missing that the other aspect of that. And I don't like the word noblesse oblige for a lot of reasons, which we don't have to get into, but there's another aspect to it, which is like, okay, let's say you get the advanced degree, like, isn't part of what you have to do isn't just like rise to become the president of Harvard or like become a lawyer on the Supreme Court, but actually like go back to like where you live and like decide like, hey, I want to be someone who like I've learned all this fancy like neuroscience and abstract algebra. I want to create a system now that I know what it's about to encourage this process in others. And maybe I only identify only like 15 people in my town of like 50,000 people, but it's worth it to like create a process to surface those 15 people who have the talent to actually become the astrophysicist at some point. And I feel like there was a more embodied understanding of liberalism that existed, which included that sense of like cultural or educational like obligation. I don't think it exists now.
Yeah, it feels like maybe again, I don't know if it's that leveling effect or there's just too many people for the system to work, but it feels like, again, like, be it the religious side or like the original, when liberalism as an idea first started to arise, and like, I mean, like capital L liberalism, like John Locke type stuff, it existed in like a really particular context. And now we just live in different material conditions in a different context. And I don't know about you, but I feel this, and I see a lot of people saying this, that we're kind of at a transition period, and or we've been in one for a while, and we've kind of stayed too long at the party of the 20th century. And I don't know what the next thing is going to be. I talked with Ancient Problems about this in one of my first podcasts. Is I think we need to go back to and not even like in an ethnic or cultural sense, but being more honest about different people, different groups, and different desires that people have, and not being so reliant on the credentialism and like that what do they call it, like the Westphalian piece of like it was again like a very specific ideology of like, let's not acknowledge any of this stuff because it kind of came from years of war in Europe, and it's a different world, a different continent, and being a little bit more open and honest, and I don't want to say mercenary, but finding a way to renegotiate, because obviously like the systems that we have right now are not cutting it. So I don't know if that made any sense, but I'm trying to get at something.
And I think I responded to one of your posts a while ago about yeah, I mean, at this point, World War II has become more of like a mythology than like a set of facts in history. And maybe that was necessary at a time. But I think the big problem that I see is that it's kind of like what happens is that you have all these people who are used to or like very defensive of this post-war model of what economics should look like, of what trade should look like, of what education should look like, of what credentialing looks like. And they're so fixated on that, it creates this reaction where you have now a bunch of millennials and Zoomers who are very eagerly like ready to tear it apart, root and stem. And I'm someone who doesn't want to, I don't want to stay stuck in the 20th century. I think it is time to find a new set of mythology or new sets of things to work on that answers this question again of like, what are the rights and responsibilities of an American citizen that isn't just reliant on like, Israel is good because 6 million Jews got gassed and Hitler is ontologically evil like the devil, like that sort of thing. But I do get nervous because I think all the people who are easy to rip it apart, when you rip something apart, like a mythology, it's, you know, it will lead to unexpected results. It won't necessarily automatically lead to another like beautiful ordered mythology. It will probably lead to a lot of like chaos and vying for power as different people want to impose their own set of mythology. And so if there's any like blame to be put, certainly some of the reactionaries have blame, but it's like, I think the people who are in charge of, so to speak, to the degree there are people in charge of it, whether it's the presidents of universities or CEOs of tech companies or people who work in government, who are like sort of mythological or intellectual leaders, like they have abdicated a responsibility to articulate how the mythology should move on from like, you know, the post-war 20th century, you know, insistence on like presenting this very like narrow view of what good and evil looks like. And that's like bad because it just gives the reactionaries more fodder to like completely like eagerly and blood, you know, with a lot of bloodlust, more and more tear into it. And so that's why you end up seeing people like Martyr Maid, who I think are actually trying to do a responsible job of presenting the history as history. And so I get very annoyed when people come after him for being an anti-Semite, because it's like, I think he's someone who's actually trying to say like, look, this is just historical fact. We should try to grapple with it so we like learn how to create a new like cohesive American identity in the future. And the reaction that he gets from the people who are so stuck in this post-war paradigm, it's not doing anyone any favors.
Yeah. Well, if anything, I feel like something like that, like it in some ways like increases something like anti-Semitism when you see like somebody who, and again, asterisk, like I haven't listened to or read everything that Daryl Cooper has ever said, but I listened to both the Tucker Carlson interview and his more recent Joe Rogan one, and he didn't say anything that's like historically inaccurate. Maybe like, you know, I understand, especially if like you're British, like, you know, coming down harder on Churchill. that's a part of their national myth, right? Even more so than like FDR is as a good figure in the U.S. Because I feel like weirdly enough, despite how important he was to our history, him as a singular figure has like an undersized role in like American popular culture, but that's neither here nor there. But you see these totally outsized responses to it, and then like the reactionary is like, oh, it's the Jews, they're keeping us from talking about this. And if you I've talked about this before in a podcast, is if you talk to these people, it's inevitable they say something like, oh, well, you couldn't gas and cremate 6 million people in 2 years. Like, well, no, that was only, no mainstream Holocaust historian says that was actually a minority of people. Like the majority happened on the Eastern Front, and which is something that Daryl Cooper alluded to. But if you're so in love with the myth itself, then like people start rebelling against and trying to pick apart the myth rather than the actual history, which is what I think Daryl Cooper or people like him, and I'm trying to write about, not that specifically, but for me, I'm somebody about Winston Churchill or Andrew Jackson or Mao, who are more complicated figures than that 20th century mythology will allow for.
Yeah. And this, by the way, goes back to, we didn't specifically talk about, views on immigration, but when we talk about immigration and integration, like I take a pretty hard line stance on immigration, specifically because of the H-1B issue. Like I'm a pretty strong immigration restrictionist. But besides that, in terms of, okay, let's say you restrict immigration and you have, let's say, people from Asia or India who you want to integrate as be Americans, I think one criteria, which I don't know how to evaluate, that helps them integrate, is you want them to be able to realistically be like, okay, I understand like the history of the 20th century and how like FDR and other people defined its character. And I think that's important, and I want to pay respect to it and voice, my understanding of how that matters. And then also then like give them the freedom to figure out I think in a healthy society, whether it's like literally me and you, but someone like me and you would be able to co-participate on a project that says, now that we understand we have a mutual respect for the 20th century, like let's figure out what comes next, because obviously it's not working. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't exist either.
Yeah, we're a quarter of the way into the 21st century now, and it feels like we're still living in the 20th. But in regards to, I'm interested specifically if you want to dig into specifically the H-1B, because technically it's for lots of different countries, but it's very practically, it's like overwhelmingly Indian. And also you being an immigration restrictionist, because, I'd like to say, I'm trying to move away from the heterodox label just because it's become kind of a meme in its own way. But like one of the ways that I'm more right-wing is on immigration, but that's to say, like, I have the left-wing opinion on immigration from 30 years ago. So all that to say, I'm curious, because to me, like, I think some immigration is good. And it's been the history of the United States is to have waves of immigration. But like you said, like teaching and understanding actual history about how immigration and integration worked, because there's this, like, especially with like really liberal people, I feel like and it's not totally wrong that it was like, all the white people came over and they did slavery and genocide, and they were all white and did white people stuff together. And then we started getting brown people in the 60s, and they, any objection that the people who came before, who are European heritage, totally, there could never be any legitimate grievances they had, and anybody coming after that is automatically good, which if you learn the history, like, it was not that smooth, even amongst white groups. The second instance of the Ku Klux Klan, for example, was way more concerned with like Irish and like Italian and Catholic in particular. So to me, like, that is the story of America. And that's kind of what I was getting at when I see somebody like you, or like, newer immigrants as American as you or I. And that totally makes sense to me, because either somebody like you who's doing like the very mindful work to understand it, or people who implicitly live in communities and there's a two-way diffusion. But that having been said, of me being my lib, immigration is good, but there's more complicated. There is something, especially to me working in the tech world, of the H-1B that sticks in my craw because it feels very extractive, or much in the same way. And it also, like, these people are getting exploited. Like, you probably met people like that. I knew a senior software engineer who was an H-1B who was making like $20 take-home pay versus the millions and millions of people who came in the last 4 years who are just getting exploited. And those things like stick in the craw more. And that doesn't, it's harder for me to square that type of mass migration than the waves of immigration that come and become integrated and become a part of the American story.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that you said about extractive is mostly because I think, and that really hits at a point, particularly for the H-1B issue, particularly, let's say, for like Indian and maybe even other East Asian immigrants, is because so much of like the model of technology is like a very extractive system. Like, I don't think, like, so when I worked at Google, and I worked on like the infrastructure team, and so the infrastructure team serves a lot of different things. It serves obviously like Google's product of search and ads, but it also serves like grad students who are running like their machine learning projects, and it serves like people who are running their like candle businesses on like Etsy and like other sorts of things. And so for me, like, that was just a very interesting problem to cut my teeth on, which is like, how do you run a really large scale infrastructure system that tries to support a lot of different use cases across the world? But most of the money for like my salary and like all of the other things we're doing came from like an ad funded model from Google. Like, that's their main product, is search and ads. And so like, that is an extractive model. Like, it's nice that someone gets paid $180,000 a year to like work on infrastructure. Maybe it's not so nice that it comes at like trying to sell you like 60 dildos at a discount on it, you know, wherever, right? Or whatever else it is. And so I think like, obviously there's some notion of like, for things like physical labor and stuff like that, like in construction or farming or other things, like, I think it's pretty much an allied, like, I don't have any like animosity towards like Mexican immigrants or people who are doing those sorts of jobs. But I think for something like technology, because like the IT sector specifically, because its business model is so extractive, I think like it's horseshit that the same argument, oh, like we need immigrants in order to like do innovation to increase the bottom line. I just find that horseshit, because I don't think fundamentally in a lot of cases, these companies are doing any sort of like innovation that somebody in the like, this goes back to the thing about making money, right? And I think there's a tweet in this piece that I'll send you on this Tortuga Technical Institute, but there's this guy, Ben Braddock, on Twitter, and he talks about like, this is a line that people take, right? It's like, well, Americans don't want to do these tech jobs, and so we need immigrants to blah, blah, blah. I don't even think we know for like the past 30 years whether Americans or not want to like work in technology, because all of the talented Americans have been sucked into like law and venture capital and like academia and like, you know, being a project manager for like a smoothie company or something like this, right? I don't think we've actually invested any effort into training and figuring out whether Americans have the capacity and the interest and the talent to actually make some really cool technologies, whether that's in like creating lab grown meat or like actually working on like rocketry or like deploying a machine learning server into space or whatever you have it, right? And so this line that people take, that's like, oh, well, Americans like don't want to do these jobs and they're not, no, they want to make a paycheck. It's a smart decision if you need to get a paycheck and, you know, raise a family, that you like go into law and you become some stupid patent lawyer for like an alarm clock that Walmart sells or whatever. But that doesn't actually tell us whether or not Americans, you know, have the penchant to do like 21st century types of technology. And given that before the internet, Americans put a man on the moon in like the 1970s, like I imagine they still have that talent if they were invested into it. And so I just don't buy this line that the only way to like keep up the innovation in tech is through H1B. It just sounds like coke.
Yeah, well, at least to me, in either case, be it the H-1B immigrants in the tech world or illegal immigrants or, the mass migration that happened, it's to me, like you said, it comes down to the money again. I do think Americans can and do want to do these jobs, but they don't want to work at the wages that these companies are willing to pay, is really what it comes down to. Because I work, I'm taking a little bit of a break after getting laid off to try to find the right position, since I'm lucky enough that, I have savings and a support network where I don't have to take like, a help desk job or something like that. That having been said, the market is totally oversaturated and over leveraged with, endless recruiting companies and stuff like that. And I think there are people who do and want to and can do the work, but they will want a salary that, reflects cost of living, how much they put into education, companies that they feel like, it's a two-way investment. And, I don't think like, if you're living in a different country and the standard of living and rate of pay is so much lower, that you're willing to take these, frankly, kind of desperate roles. And again, like I saw, just the amount, I don't feel animosity towards these people necessarily, but we do have like fundamentally different interests economically, and I think that creates animosity just based on that.
Yeah, I think the other thing too, I'll say, and this is maybe a little bit of a tangent, but I'll just give you a quick example of. So I think there are a lot of people, like whether they're white or not, who actually don't want to participate exclusively in these extractive technological business models. And then there's this accusation that a lot of people give that like, oh well, Americans don't want to do the jobs that are like dirty or hard to do. And I also find that to be cope. And I'll give an example as to that, which is when I moved to this town, I had I was rebuilding houses for people, and this was through a nonprofit, but I ended up meeting this lady, and basically it was really tragic. She had just bought the house and like a month before, and then like the flood washed it away, and so we built a new house for her. But she'd recently gone through a divorce. And so like she was like selling scrap, like she was doing a lot of scrapyard stuff for money, right? Which, if she was really good at it, like you can get all sorts of tools, like copper wire, silver wire, you can make enough to like live in a trailer home and stuff like that, right? And then I got to talking to her because at one point I was leading a volunteer group and we planted a garden in her new house. And she was like, oh, well, I used to do house cleaning for a living. And I was like, oh, well, I need my house clean. Will you come clean it for me? And so I built a relationship with her where I paid her pretty well. I actually offered to pay her more than I currently pay her. But she was like, no, this is fair. And then what I did was I also started like looking for other clients on her behalf because everybody needs their fucking house cleaned. Keep in mind, this is the woman who's like in her 60s. She's lived a rich life. She has kids and grandkids, but she still likes to work and she's willing to do like the dirty labor of cleaning somebody's house. And so I ended up finding like this really good client for her. And then she's built a business, like a little bit of a business where she has business cards now and stuff like that. And so to me, that's another aspect of like, when people say like Americans don't want to do the job, well, have you taken up the responsibility of an American citizen to like finding ways that you can slot people into these jobs that you claim that Americans want to do? Because I'm pretty sure if you gave them the right opportunity, some of them will. Now, some people won't, right? Like, there's a good 15% of the population that, never wants to work. They're just antisocial. They don't want to get involved in that. But there's a good people, like if you immediately after you go out of that, like 10-15% of people who are just generally criminal and are never going to do something productive. It was not that hard for me to find an opportunity for this lady to do it. And so I also think it's cope when people say we need immigration so that, they can do the jobs that Americans want to do. Like my life experience has just been so contradictory to that line of argument.
Yeah, well, I agree with you 100% because I feel like I have maybe a unique perspective. Like I've been on both sides of that. Like I was a chef for a while, but I cleaned office parks for a while. Like I did that as a second job when I was saving up money for a move. And, people, native born Americans of, various ethnicities would do it but the pay was shit. And then I transitioned to working in tech and seeing on the other side. But yeah, that's probably the thing. One of the things that makes me the most mad is, like you said, Americans do want to do it, but the infrastructure doesn't exist for it. So these people, and I see like a lot of like more wealthy people, and again, a lot of like wealthy white liberals who they feel like they're doing some kind of social good by basically exploiting slave labor of people coming here from South America or the third world. It's like, oh, Americans are lazy. And it feels like this is another thing I'm trying to find a way to write about in a way that's nuanced, but I feel like one of the underrated like racism types of racism that exist in America is like bougie, like East Coast or suburban college educated whites who have just open ethnic hatred for like poor rural whites, and they
Yeah.
wouldn't ever consider empathizing with these people.
Yeah, totally. And again, you pay people like a decent wage. Like most of the people that you're talking about, who are considered rural trash by like, Boston educated people, you pay them like pretty decent. It doesn't even have to be that high. Like right now I'm living in like a 1,000 square foot house. It's a nice 2-bedroom. It's like good for a single person, maybe like a starter family if they wanted that. And like the lady comes and cleans, and like she spends like a couple hours, usually it's by herself or usually it's someone. I pay her like $75 every time. I would offer to pay her more, but she doesn't want that, and it helps her like pay her bills for a lot of stuff, like get her groceries and stuff like that. But it's not like paying her like $20 to do the whole fucking thing, which then she has to split with like all of her family who lives in Guatemala,
Yeah.
And so it's like it's not even that hard if you want to like, this is aside from discussions on like policy around minimum wage. Like people can choose to pay like relatively a little bit more, not that much, and you'll find that suddenly all of these like heritage Americans will sign up to like do all the hard jobs or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. It's just these entire lines of arguments that I've seen for so long around immigration. I just feel like they're such cope.
Well, basically, yeah, people want there to be cheap and easy stuff. And realistically, that's another thing that I think is just going to have to change. Like American prices for things in America have been kept artificially low, but so have wages. And with inflation really taking off, especially in the last decade, I feel like things are starting to cost closer to what they should, but wages have not kept up across the board. It's very easy for people like us who work in the tech world to make decent money for honestly I don't want to say easier work, but it's a different type of work. I think I definitely worked way harder washing dishes than I ever did like building data centers and like configuring a bunch of switches and stuff like that. But I don't know. I'll be curious to see how things shake down, because I feel like if we get rid of this unnatural economic relationship, and again, the jury is still out. We're recording this in late March, so we'll see what happens by the couple weeks when this is released. Jury's still out on Doge and everything that's happening. Maybe there just needs to be rapid change and see how things reconfigure. Maybe it'll be worse. At this point, I have no idea.
Yeah, and I'll say something too, which is that one thing I really like about this company that I'm working at is that there's a lot of people talking about how AI is going to take jobs, but a lot of like the AI characters that we're generating for various platforms, like one of the considerations we're having is like, is there ways that we can use like AI to create jobs for people, right? So like, I'll just give you an example. Like right now, I haven't had health insurance for like a number of years, right? And so I have this like conglomeration of various things that I do, whether I visit like the health clinic in my town, which is like on a sliding scale of income, or like visit urgent care, or I pay for blood tests and health coaches out of my own HSA and stuff like that, right? But I had a conversation with my boss, right? And I was like, what if you could create like an AI healthcare character that basically, like for someone like me, I like put in all of my inputs, and then I want somebody who can like be in charge of like collecting the documentation and then like giving me recommendation, telling me how much I'm spending because I'm shit at that. Like I don't know how much I've spent from my HSA. I just know my balance at the end of this month. And like you could have that AI character also integrated with like a payment platform, whether it's cryptocurrency or not, that submits it directly into their wallet and stuff like that. And I was like, this is awesome, because we're not just talking about, you know, using like AI agents to like take everybody's labor away, but actually find other like opportunities for people to do meaningful work that would actually serve clients in ways. And so that's also something that I'm like, that's like, it's, you know, it's a choice whether people want to find like ways to support people in their own country on like jobs, regardless of the technological stack. And so I just find this idea that like everyone should be so afraid that like their jobs are going to go to waste and blah, blah, blah. It's like there are still choices you can make to help like patron people who you care about in your own community and society. And so
yeah, I do see it's an interesting topic because in some ways, like I'm probably naturally a more like misanthropic person where I see like, okay, I see how this is going to be, you know, everybody has their own personalized version of I have no mouth and I must scream. But that having been said, like you're talking, the two sides I see of it is somebody who works in a technical field or white collar, what have you, you could get a lot of use out of it. But somebody like the woman who cleans your house, not necessarily going to get a lot of use out of it. But there is a lot of potential for it. You could have an AI agent that kind of takes the role that you took of, you know, hey, you did a good job here. Let me find you some clients. Let me find you, you know, find a good pricing structure. And there was kind of stuff that they tried to do with this. I forget the exact name of the app, but like, you know, trading tasks, a smarter way to do this. There's definitely the potential there. But I think, and I know you said you don't like the term noblesse oblige, but if there was more of an obligation with the tech class and the people in charge of making you know, these companies, that was like, let me reinvest in the community that because America is basically becoming a shopping mall as far as I'm concerned. Like, all right, let me continue to invest in this, because say what you will about like, you know, Rockefeller or people like that of that, you know, the Gilded Age. At the very least, they built railroads, and maybe that could be, you know, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, these people. That could be their version of building railroads, is creating technical infrastructure that people can use, that will be more beneficial. Because right now, like I was talking with somebody else, a guy on Substack, bigger on YouTube, called Feral Historian, and he's a little bit older and still believes in that the explorer spirit. Like, 'cause to me, like I don't give a fuck if Elon Musk goes to Mars, because how does that affect me or my life? It's like, neat, you've done with private money what, you know, the public did in the 1960s. Cool. I don't care about beating the Russians or the Chinese, but you could maybe get more buy-in with a national project if there was, you know, companies that were investing more in the company that, or sorry, the maybe Freudian slip, not the company, but the country that they exist in and are benefiting from.
Yeah. So I talked a little bit about this, about how like it's symbolic, but also pretty interesting that, for example, Anduril, the defense company started by Palmer Luckey, moved one of its manufacturing things to plants to Ohio. Mm-hmm. And I actually do think, and because some of the ways that globalization is breaking, and a lot of trade relationships, especially with, you know, the US dollar being artificially messed with in a lot of ways, that we probably will see a lot of people who have more of a patriotic orientation maybe move some of their manufacturing and other capabilities, maybe towards Heartland USA. And, you know, that'll be interesting. I think the US has one of the reasons, you know, shipping is so cheap is it has one of the best waterways in the entire world, right? And so
you read Peter Zion presumably with that?
I haven't. No, he
talks about that a lot, but never mind, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's definitely I think we might see more movements like that happening, where
that's what I'm hoping for, because I think, at least to me, like there's, when you're talking about even like people on the personal individual level. We talk about like the Christian LARPers, like, oh, this is how the world should work. Here's my ideology. It should be top down. But this is, I guess, my more leftist side is I think people are ultimately controlled by the material conditions. You can only make the choices that are given to you based on the incentive structures that exist. And during globalization, like you said, that's where the incentives existed. So people are going to build infrastructure based on that. And now that we're seeing globalization start to fall apart, maybe we'll see more of that. And that's what I hope, because you talked about doing infrastructure side. That was kind of more what I did in the tech world, infrastructure, network engineer stuff. And our infrastructure and cybersecurity in the United States is dog shit. And there's so much, or even I know people who work in like utilities for electricity and the power grid. It's not good, folks, as Trump would say. It's very bad. I think there's so much potential there, which could be like, if I'm still like, I'm becoming more and more cynical about Trump by the day, but he could be the new FDR if he did, what FDR did for physical infrastructure, which also needs work. If he were to do that for like our power grid and our internet infrastructure, like, this is maybe too inside baseball for people who don't understand the tech world, but so much of our internet infrastructure is still based on like cable and copper wiring. Like, we could upgrade to fiber. There's so much that we could do that there's so much for the taking there. You just need to have leadership that wants to invest in it. And that's how you could get, and if you want to like loop it back in to getting people, recent immigrants, H-1B or physical labor migrants, what have you, have these people also be a part of building it, and then they'll be more invested in it, as well as heritage Americans of all ethnicities. And I count Black people as heritage Americans, because why the fuck wouldn't you if they've been here for 400 years? But that's neither, I think it all kind of loops together.
Yeah. So probably we can wrap this up in the next couple of minutes, because mostly I'm getting tired.
Fair enough. Sorry, I went off there.
Oh, no, I like it. It's actually a measure of success, right? We've had such an interesting discussion that I'm starting to get tired. So
no, that's fine. We were kind of getting to the end of what I wanted to talk about anyway. So I'm curious, do you have any plugs, promotions, any pieces or podcasts or anything coming up in the near future that you want to tell people to look out for?
Well, I'll send you for people who liked our tech discussion, I'll send you this piece over DM, which again, I have become sort of Walt Bismarck's right-hand man for the Tortuga Society. And we started something called the Tortuga Technical Institute. I will have you promote that piece. And then, I mean, in terms of Substack, definitely check out my blog. You can post whichever pieces you like that you read in that show notes. I'm not someone who, I think my orientation towards writing, it's never been my goal to like build a platform for people. I like working with some people who do that. It's nice that when I meet people like you through others who have a platform, that's good. If there's anyone who wants to talk to me about something that I've written, that's fine. I would have plugged in like maybe about like 6 months to a year ago. I was like more actively doing coaching on stuff. And that was like one of my main sources of income. I've kind of stepped away from that for a little bit. But it was like a combination of like kind of therapy like coaching, but also business like coaching. So it's like, hey, I'm looking for a purpose and I maybe have a project or an idea or a service that I want to monetize. If someone has gotten to the end of the episode and they like super are in love with everything that I've said in this podcast and they think I would be a great coach, you can reach out to me. But I don't necessarily know if you need to plug that. And then let's see, whatever else. I'm looking for a spouse. If you want to date me, no, I'm just kidding.
He's handsome, folks. We love him.
I'm only half joking with that, but I'm not sure how likely it is I'll meet my future spouse. If I meet my future spouse through your podcast, that'll be a story for the ages. But yeah, that's about it. I don't have anything official at this point. I'll let you know if I change my mind before you publish, but yeah, that's kind of where I stand.
Perfect. Well, we'll do the sign off question that I always like to do, since it wasn't particularly doom and gloom. But what is something that makes you feel hopeful for the future, or if you don't have anything, what's something that would make you feel hopeful for the future?
Oh, interesting question. Um, well, maybe I'll answer this in a personal way, which is, my I really felt a lot of like desperation and hopelessness about my life and where it was heading in 2021. And in 2025, there are still a lot of things in that area that I struggle with in terms of like meaning, friendship, intimacy, health. But there are a lot of ways in which it's gotten a lot better. Um, and my health is really good. I'm doing really well at MMA. I've found, at least for now, like a job where I can do some interesting things. And so I guess my hope is that, like, COVID, I think, was this is how we started the conversation. Like, COVID was a really, really dark moment for me personally and for a lot of people, and like just a dark moment for our country in so many different ways. And I do have a lot of hope that, like, there are a lot of optimistic things in terms of like technology and personal agency and other sorts of things that are coming down the line. And I imagine I wouldn't say I'm in a good place right now, but I imagine things are probably going to keep getting better with setbacks. But I imagine like things are going to be a lot different, and a lot of it is going to be for the good in, like, I don't know, 2030, 2032. And yeah, I hope, cross my fingers, but I imagine, like, for the most part, like, I have very few anorexic episodes anymore, stuff like that. So I think, like, I will look forward to participating in, like, civic American life in productive ways, in the next decade. And, I think I'll hopefully find other people who are in a similar boat. So, yeah.
Well, that's great. I'm happy for you. And with that, Rajeev, I appreciate you coming on. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks. I had fun too.
Yeah, take it easy.